There's a moment that almost everyone who has ever tutored a younger sibling, trained a new coworker, or tried to explain their job to a curious kid at a dinner party has run into. You start talking, confident, maybe even a little proud of how well you know the material, and then somewhere around the third sentence, you stall out. You reach for the next piece of the explanation, and it just isn't there. You knew this. You would have sworn you knew this an hour ago. So, what happened between knowing it and saying it? That gap is not a personal failing, and it's not evidence that you were faking competence the whole time. It's actually one of the more reliable findings in learning research, and it turns out to be the reason explaining things out loud to another person might be one of the most effective ways to learn something in the first place. Today, I want to walk through why that is, because the answer isn't simply teaching is good for you. The evidence is more specific than that, and honestly more interesting. It suggests that the benefit of teaching depends on which parts of teaching you actually do. Let's start with the assumption most of us carry around without examining it. We tend to think explaining helps because it's motivating. You care more about getting something right when someone else is depending on your explanation. Researchers actually have a name for this, the protege effect, and there's real evidence behind it. Studies designed around teachable agents, computer programs built specifically to let a learner take on the role of teacher, are constructed on the premise that simply being placed in a teaching role changes how invested you become in the material. Preparing to teach something also seems to organize your thinking differently than preparing to learn it for yourself. When people expect they'll need to explain a topic to someone else, they tend to build more organized cognitive structures than when they expect to be tested on it privately. So the expectation of teaching does something, that part is not in dispute. What's more contested and honestly more useful to understand is whether that expectation alone is doing the heavy lifting or whether the real benefit comes from something that happens later during the explaining itself. Here's where it gets interesting because there's a well documented phenomenon that complicates the simple story that expecting to teach is basically the whole mechanism. It's called the illusion of explanatory depth, and it describes something most of us have felt without having a name for it. People tend to believe they understand how things work, complex mechanical systems, political policies, even everyday objects like a zipper or a bicycle, in far more detail than they actually do. That confidence collapses almost immediately the moment someone asks you to explain the mechanism step by step. You knew the bicycle had pedals and a chain. You did not actually know how the chain transferred force to the wheel, or why gears changed the difficulty of pedaling. The feeling of understanding and the actual capacity to produce a mechanistic explanation are, it turns out, two different things, and your brain doesn't reliably distinguish between them until you're forced to. Part of what seems to drive this illusion is a kind of confusion between what's stored in your own head and what's simply available to you, either through other people or through your environment. If you've ever looked something up, watched someone else do it, or absorbed the gist of an explanation without personally reconstructing it, you can end up with a feeling of ownership over that knowledge that outpaces what you could actually reproduce on your own. There's also something almost paradoxical in how this plays out with access to information. Some research has found that merely believing you could look up an explanation without ever actually reading it is enough to inflate your sense of understanding. Just knowing the explanation exists somewhere reachable seems to create a kind of borrowed confidence. That's worth sitting with for a second because it suggests the illusion isn't really about information at all. It's about a felt sense of empowerment that has almost nothing to do with what's actually stored in your memory. This matters enormously for how we think about studying. When you read a textbook chapter or watch a lecture or reread your own notes, you're engaging with material that has already been organized for you. The structure is there, the logic connects, And because recognizing a well organized explanation feels remarkably similar to generating one yourself, it's easy to walk away from that kind of studying with an inflated sense of how solid your understanding actually is. Researchers who study metacognition, which is essentially your ability to accurately judge your own knowledge, have found that many learners rely on a kind of recognition as mastery heuristic. If the material feels familiar, if you can follow along without confusion, you assume you could reproduce it. That assumption is often wrong, and it's wrong in a fairly predictable direction. People consistently overestimate what they'll be able to recall and explain later, precisely because familiarity during study doesn't require the same cognitive work as generation does. This is where explaining something out loud starts to earn its reputation as a serious learning tool rather than just a nice bonus activity. Explaining requires generative retrieval. You can't lean on the structure someone else built for you. You have to reconstruct the logic yourself in real time, often while someone is watching or listening, which adds a layer of pressure that private review simply doesn't have. And what that reconstruction reveals, almost immediately, is exactly where your knowledge is fragmented rather than integrated. You get partway through an explanation and realize you don't actually know why one step leads to the next. That's not a failure of the explaining process. That's the explaining process working exactly as intended. It's converting a vague, comfortable feeling of knowing into a specific, uncomfortable, and much more accurate picture of what you actually know and where the gaps are. There's a useful distinction researchers have drawn here between two things that often get lumped together under the umbrella of active learning: restructuring and retrieval. They sound similar and they do sometimes work together, but they seem to be doing different jobs. Retrieval, in the narrow sense, is pulling a fact or a procedure back out of memory. It strengthens the memory trace for that specific item. If you retrieve the same fact successfully several times, it becomes more durable and more accessible later. That's valuable, and it's part of why spaced repetition and practice testing work as well as they do. But retrieval on its own tends to be fairly item specific. It makes the thing you practiced more memorable. It doesn't necessarily make you better at understanding related things you haven't practiced yet. Restructuring is different. It's what happens when explaining forces you to focus on the underlying structure of an idea rather than just the surface details. Instead of asking what happened, you're forced to ask, why did this happen? And how does it connect to the other things I know? That kind of processing seems to engage deeper conceptual integration. Self explanation studies have found that this structural focus, rather than simple recall, is what predicts long term retention. In fact, some of this research has found that how well someone explains a concept, the quality of their self explanation, predicts how much they remember weeks later far more reliably than how well they perform on an immediate quiz right after studying. Immediate performance and durable understanding, in other words, are not the same thing, and explaining seems to be selectively good at building the kind that lasts. I think it's worth pausing here to be honest about something the research doesn't fully resolve, which is exactly how these two mechanisms interact. Some studies have found that combining retrieval practice with other generative strategies, like drawing a diagram or building a concept map, doesn't produce additional benefit beyond retrieval alone. That's a little counterintuitive. If you assumed more active strategies simply stack on top of each other, it suggests retrieval and restructuring might be running on somewhat separate tracks, each contributing something useful, but not necessarily amplifying each other just because you're doing more things at once. What seems to matter more than quantity of activity is whether the activity you're doing is actually forcing you to reconstruct the underlying logic rather than just exercising a memory trace you've already got. So, if restructuring is doing a lot of the conceptual work, what exactly makes an explanation good at producing it? This is where the research gets specific in a way I find genuinely useful because it moves us past the vague advice to just explain things more and towards something closer to a mechanism. The clearest predictor across several of these studies is what's sometimes called constructive elaboration. That's a fairly clinical term for something intuitive once you unpack it. It means the explanation requires you to generate new relationships between the material and things you already know, rather than simply reproducing what you were told. Low generative activities, like rereading a passage or copying notes verbatim, don't ask much of you cognitively. You can do them almost passively. Constructive elaboration asks you to build something, and building something, even something small, seems to change how the material gets encoded. This shows up in some fairly granular findings. In studies where learners explained video lessons out loud, the amount of paraphrasing they did, meaning how much they put the material into their own words rather than repeating the presenter's phrasing, correlated positively with how much they actually learned. That's a small, almost mechanical detail, but it points at something real. Paraphrasing forces you to run the idea through your own conceptual framework instead of just echoing someone else's. It's the linguistic version of restructuring. Scaffolding matters too, and this is a place where I think the research pushes back gently against the idea that unstructured explanation is automatically good. Some studies have found that fill in the blank style prompts, which give learners a partial structure to complete rather than a totally blank page, produce the strongest learning advantage in certain video based lessons. That might sound like it's working against the idea of generative effort since you're giving the learner some of the structure rather than making them build it entirely from scratch. But I think what's actually happening is that scaffolding manages the difficulty of the generative task so the learner can still produce a full explanation without getting so overwhelmed that they give up or produce something shallow. There's a difference between generative effort that's productive and generative effort that's just frustrating. And scaffolding seems to be one of the tools that keeps a learner on the productive side of that line. Feedback plays a similar role. Explanation alone without any correction can let a wrong idea calcify just as easily as it lets a correct one solidify. Some research on worked examples found that when learners received corrective feedback alongside self explanation prompts, their outcomes improved beyond what self explanation produced by itself. That makes intuitive sense once you think about it. Explaining exposes a gap, but exposing a gap doesn't automatically fill it correctly. You need something, either a knowledgeable person, a well designed system, or your own careful cross checking against a reliable source to confirm whether the explanation you generated was actually right. There's also a distinction in this research between learners who actively question and critique the material they're working with and learners who essentially just copy or reproduce it. In studies involving programming education supported by generative AI tools, the students who performed better were the ones who evaluated, questioned, and selectively applied what the tool produced, rather than accepting it wholesale. Lower performing students tended to offload their thinking onto the tool instead of using it as a starting point for their own reasoning. I think that's a pattern worth remembering well beyond the classroom because it applies just as much to explaining something to a friend as it does to working with an AI assistant. The explanatory act only does its job if you're actually doing the cognitive work, rather than just producing words that sound like an explanation. Now, all of this so far has been about explaining in a fairly general sense, whether to yourself, to a fictional student, or out loud to nobody in particular. But the question I actually want to get at today is more specific. What happens when the person you're explaining to is real? And what happens when you're not just explaining a single idea, but genuinely teaching, meaning you're responsible for organizing a whole lesson, anticipating what someone else won't understand, and adjusting based on how they respond? This is where two recent studies give us a genuinely useful contrast because they were designed around slightly different versions of the teaching experience, and the results diverge in a way that's worth taking seriously. The first involved people teaching a conversational agent using natural language, essentially explaining a concept out loud or in writing to an AI system built to simulate a novice learner. The researchers were specifically interested in the protege effect, that idea we talked about earlier, where being placed in a teaching role increases your investment in the material. And in some ways, the setup worked as expected. Participants who taught the agent using natural language reported that the experience felt more helpful than a simpler comparison condition where they just selected relevant sentences rather than generating a full explanation. They felt more engaged, they put in more effort. Their explanations, when the researchers measured how much paraphrasing occurred, showed that paraphrasing itself was positively related to learning outcomes, which fits with everything we've just discussed about constructive elaboration. But here's the part that complicates the simple story. Despite feeling more helpful, and despite requiring more generative effort, natural language teaching to the agent produced learning gains that were similar to, or in some conditions, slightly smaller than, the much simpler sentence selection task. In other words, subjective effort and subjective helpfulness didn't reliably translate into a larger, measurable learning gain. That's a fairly important finding because it suggests that simply feeling like you're doing something effortful and worthwhile isn't the same as that effort producing proportionally more learning. The teachable agent could expose some of its own reasoning back to the learner, and it could function as a stand in for a novice who needed things explained clearly, but the interaction itself was still fairly constrained, a fixed exchange without the kind of ongoing responsibility a real teaching relationship involves. Compare that to the second study, which looked at something considerably fuller in scope. Nursing students were placed in a learning by teaching format where they didn't just explain a single concept, they took on responsibility for planning an entire lesson, choosing their own instructional strategy, preparing materials, and then delivering that lesson to their peers, who were real people with real gaps in understanding and real questions that needed answering on the spot. The measured outcomes here weren't just self reported helpfulness or engagement. Researchers tracked actual pre and post knowledge scores and hands on skill assessments. And across the groups in that study, both theoretical knowledge and practical skill improved significantly. What I find most useful about putting these two studies side by side isn't that one proves teaching works and the other proves it doesn't. It's that they help separate out which parts of the teaching experience seem to matter most. A real, unpredictable learner does not appear to be strictly necessary just to generate engagement. The teachable agent study shows people can feel invested and produce meaningful paraphrasing even when their student is a program following a script. But engagement and subjective effort are not the same thing as durable learning gain. The bigger, more consistent gains in the nursing study came from a version of teaching that included several elements stacked together: planning the lesson from scratch, taking responsibility for someone else's actual understanding, adapting delivery to real peers rather than a fixed interaction, and doing all of that under the kind of accountability that comes from knowing another person is genuinely depending on you to get it right. This lines up with a broader pattern that shows up when researchers compare merely expecting to teach against actually going through with the full experience of teaching. Expecting to teach does prime some useful things, motivation increases, and there's some evidence that even imagined teaching, meaning going through the mental exercise of preparing an explanation without ever delivering it to a real audience, can sustain comprehension over time. But interactive peer teaching, the kind where you're actually responding to another person in real time, tends to produce stronger, immediate comprehension than imagined teaching does, even if the imagined version holds up reasonably well over the longer delay. Different modes of teaching, in other words, seem to offer different kinds of benefit on different timelines, and the fullest version, the one involving an actual back and forth with a real learner, appears to draw on capacities the imagined or simulated versions simply don't require. There's also something worth naming here that goes beyond cognition. Teaching a real person involves a kind of relational and emotional labor that a script or a fixed interaction doesn't ask of you. You have to read whether someone is confused, adjust your explanation on the fly, notice when a metaphor isn't landing, and try a different one, and manage your own patience while doing it. Some researchers studying teacher identity have described this as a genuinely distinct dimension of teaching, one that involves imagining what the other person is experiencing and building enough connection that they're willing to admit confusion rather than nodding along. That relational demand can't really be replicated by a system designed to simulate a novice, no matter how well it exposes its own reasoning. And it may be part of why the fuller version of teaching, responsibility, adaptation, and relationship combined produces effects that a simpler explanatory exercise doesn't fully reach. This connects back to a distinction that shows up in research comparing teaching to other kinds of active learning more broadly. Teaching doesn't just strengthen memory for the material being taught. There's evidence it can actually transform how the teacher understands the subject, shifting them from a passive recipient of information into someone who has to actively construct and reorganize meaning. That's a meaningfully different process than simply reviewing material more times. Reviewing, even active reviewing, tends to operate in what researchers sometimes call knowledge lean modes, closer to habit and repetition. Teaching, especially when it requires you to integrate content with an awareness of what your specific audience needs, pulls you into a knowledge rich mode where you're constructing explanations, models, and connections rather than simply retrieving what's already there. Expert teachers, interestingly, describe developing something like a specialized attention over time, learning to notice different things in a lesson or a learner's response than a novice teacher would notice, and to actively shape their teaching to get more information about where understanding is breaking down, rather than passively delivering content and hoping it lands. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that explaining or teaching is some kind of universal cure that works regardless of context, because the evidence doesn't support that either. There are real limits, and understanding them actually makes the whole picture more useful rather than less. One important limit involves cognitive load. Explaining something, especially something complex, adds real demands on top of whatever demands the material itself already imposes. There's a well established framework in learning research that separates cognitive load into a few different types: the load inherent to the complexity of the material itself, the load created by how a task or lesson is designed, which can be wasteful if the design is poor, and the load that comes from the productive mental effort of actually building understanding. These demands are additive, and working memory, the mental workspace where you actively hold and manipulate information, has real limits. When the combined weight of complex material, poorly designed tasks, and the effort of monitoring your own understanding while explaining exceeds what your working memory can hold, something has to give. Usually, what gives is your capacity to self regulate, meaning your ability to notice when you're off track and correct course. Some research on this describes something close to an inverted U shape. For easy material, there's not much need to actively regulate your explanation because the task barely stresses your resources. For very difficult material, the load becomes so heavy that you don't have the spare capacity to monitor and adjust, even if you wanted to. The sweet spot, where active regulation and explanation seem to actually help the most, tends to sit somewhere in the middle, where the material is challenging enough to require real thought, but not so overwhelming that your working memory simply can't hold everything at once. This is worth remembering if you've ever tried to explain something incredibly complicated to someone with no background at all, and found the whole exercise more frustrating than clarifying for both of you. That's not a sign that explaining doesn't work. It might just be a sign that the material needs to be broken into smaller pieces first, so the generative effort of explaining has room to actually happen instead of getting crowded out by sheer complexity. Text complexity matters in a related way. Some studies comparing oral explanation to simple retrieval found that explaining outperformed retrieval, specifically for complex material, while for simpler material, the two approaches produced roughly similar results. That fits with everything else we've covered. If the content is simple enough that recognition and retrieval already capture most of what matters, the extra restructuring work that explaining demands doesn't have much additional value to add. It's when the material has real underlying structure, multiple interacting parts, cause and effect relationships that aren't obvious on the surface, that explaining earns its advantage because that's exactly the kind of structure retrieval alone tends to skip past. There's also a distinction worth drawing between explanation that scaffolds understanding and explanation that becomes a crutch. In one line of research on learning by explaining video lectures, students who explained material from memory, without any visual aid to lean on, showed a meaningful advantage in transferring their understanding to new problems. Students who explained the same material while looking at provided visuals produced explanations that were, on the surface, more comprehensive and detailed. But that extra detail didn't translate into better transfer. The visuals seem to have let them describe what they were looking at without forcing the same internal reconstruction that explaining from memory demanded. It's a subtle but important distinction. More thorough sounding explanations aren't automatically more useful ones if the thoroughness came from copying what was in front of you rather than generating it from your own understanding. So, where does all of this leave us with the original question? Why is explaining one of the best learning strategies available to us? I think the honest answer is that explaining works because it's one of the few ordinary activities that reliably converts a private, comfortable feeling of understanding into something public, specific, and falsifiable. When you study quietly, your brain gets to lean on recognition, on familiarity, on the sense that things make sense as you read them. That feeling is real, but it's not the same thing as the capacity to reconstruct the idea from nothing. Explaining strips that comfort away almost immediately. It forces generative retrieval instead of recognition, and generative retrieval is what exposes the fragmented parts of your knowledge that recognition quietly papers over. But the deeper benefit doesn't come from explaining in the thinnest possible sense, just producing words about a topic. It comes from the quality of the reconstruction you're forced to do, whether you're integrating the idea with things you already know, whether you're organizing it around its actual structure rather than its surface features, and whether you're getting some kind of feedback from a real learner's confused expression, from a mentor's correction, or from your own careful cross checking, that tells you when your explanation went wrong. The research on teaching real peers versus teaching a simulated novice suggests something worth holding on to, which is that a real learner may not be strictly required to trigger engagement, but the fuller package of responsibility, planning, adaptation, and relationship seems to be where the largest and most durable gains tend to show up. There's something almost hopeful in that, at least to me. It means the benefit of explaining isn't locked behind some rare talent for teaching or reserved for people who happen to have students. It's available anytime you're willing to stop reviewing quietly and start reconstructing out loud, ideally to someone who might actually stop you and ask what you mean. That question, the one that interrupts your explanation and asks you to go one layer deeper, might be the single most valuable moment in the entire process. It's the moment where the illusion of understanding meets the reality of what you can actually build from what you know, and where, if you let it, real understanding finally has a chance to take its place.